Speaking of John, but that's good. I don't know if Catholics are aware of how incredibly gifted we've been with the remarkable leadership we've had in the Church, with Pope Leo and Pope Francis and Pope Benedict and John Paul. I mean, when we look back, in time, this Church has been blessed with remarkable leaders, not only in terms of the ministry, the apostolate of, the successor of Peter, but leaders throughout our Church. And sometimes important to have a long view to really recognize how the Holy Spirit is present through these persons to whom has been trusted leadership. Anyways, I'm speaking from my heart there, because that's really, it struck me when I was rereading the encyclical that's been carried by Pope Leo, that brings together elements of Catholic social thought. But Josh, I'm, as I said, French-Canadian mother, Irish working class father, East End of Montreal, and I have the immense grace of living and working in large communities in France and then in India for many, many years. So my involvement in large communities in India has opened my mind, my heart, to many different cultures and all that. When I came back from India, I went to law school, picked up a couple degrees, went to the bar, and I worked in a Catholic community organization, and as I shared with you, for 25 years as director of the Social Action Office at the Catholic Archdiocese of Montreal, doing a lot of work with immigrants, refugees, or very, very often with people who were underground, who were either waiting for a decision or who were, how should I say, illegally in the country and who had real needs. I also did one of my passions was what we call restorative justice, and doing work with victims of crime and inmates, and especially preparing resources in the community for persons who have been incarcerated often for 15, 20 years. And in that context, I was invited to be a member of the Regional Advisory Committee for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Not only because of my long-standing interest and friendship in Indigenous peoples and the history of Canada and how they have shaped this land, shaped our mindset, but because there was a real question of justice. And we cannot, I think, as a church, move forward unless we recognize our past history, our complicity with the past. So you need to seek justice and work out of love. So one of the things I can say that after the Montreal hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I was very much involved in organizing that. I said, well, what can I do? And we had change in pastor in the parish community that I was part of. And so I decided, well, I would make the St. Francis Xavier mission, the Catholic mission in McDonough, my Sunday worship community. And so that was my little gesture to build bridges, and to, most important, to learn. And one of the great things that stays with me and reinforces what you were saying here is that to build reconciliation, the most important thing is to nourish friendships. And my deepest conviction, coming out of my soon 75 years old, is the importance of friendships. Friendships is what I think really changes people's attitudes. Friendships. And so I think the idea of cultivating friendships is really, really important. So I'm just telling you who the hell I am, okay? Anyways, I have also, I should say that I have 4 adult children and 5 grandchildren. And so that's important. Look, I had a talk here that is not perhaps appropriate for a small group of informed people. But I'm just going to, what I want to do is just kind of take a couple elements and then focus a lot on some of the gems from Pope Leo's most recent encyclical. Just take out a couple of gems. You were alluding to it this morning, but I do a lot of things. I'm also a university professor, I should mention that too. But one of the things is that I also part of a, liberal arts institute. And I'm trying to get people interested in being part of a reading group for, Magnificat Humana. I'm looking mostly at Josh because I've had a chance to speak about these issues with Matthew and with you as well, and Bishop Mark has quite a bit of knowledge. But let me just give you a couple things here.
We're all taking notes and reading.
So first of all, it's important to remember that peace is a basic attribute of God. God brings peace, and God cannot and should not be associated with the perpetration of violence. And this conviction has grown over the centuries as people of faith meditate on the different understandings of God's action in the world put forth in the biblical tradition. What's wonderful in the biblical tradition, where our understanding of ourselves, our relationship with God, is always developing and growing. So we have had to grow out of the image of a violent, wrathful God found in some chapters of the Old Testament. If you don't believe me, read not only Exodus, but the book of Joshua and others. We've had to grow out of the belt-buckle logic of God's need of me, and grow out of the claim of with God on our side. I don't know if you know anything about Bob Dylan's music.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the famous song with God on our side. Over the time, we've come to understand that God's creation, which is the reflection of God's glory, aspires to peace. And as Pope Francis said in his groundbreaking encyclical, Laudato Si, all of creation forms a harmonious whole that is good in every part and proclaims God's peace. So, just kind of want to move on because I want to give plenty of room for other stuff. I'm repeating something that is very clearly articulated by not only in the compendium but in the various, positions espoused by the Church. First of all, violence is never appropriate response. It's never the proper response. Adopting the words of John Paul II and oft repeated by his successors, the Church proclaims that violence is evil, that violence is unacceptable as a solution to problems, that violence is unworthy of humanity. Violence is a lie, for it goes against the truth of our faith, the truth of our humanity, and violence destroys what it claims to defend, the dignity, the life, and the freedom of human beings. And the contemporary world needs the witness of unarmed prophets, who are often the objects of ridicule and often accused of certain naivete. So I think of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and within our own Catholic tradition, we can recall such martyrs as Franz Jagerstatter. Have you ever heard of Franz Jagerstatter? He refused to fight for Nazi Germany because of his devout Catholic faith, and this resulted in his execution. About 10 years ago, there was a remarkable film on Franz Jagerstatter. Yeah, a remarkable film. And those who renounce violence and bloodshed in their efforts to safeguard human rights, and who thereby rely on the means of defense available to the weakest, they bear witness to the gospel. And that's clearly set out. War has never been and will never be an appropriate way to resolve problems that arise between nations. In one of our first conversations, Matthew, that we had at a Zoom talk, we were aware that there was a lot of talk, not only on cable news, but on public news, which seemed to advanced the idea that, how should I say, war and violence was almost a normal normal course of things, and that moments of peace were, I'll call it interludes, And there was, as I'll speak to in a few minutes' time when we look at what the Pope Leo has to say, there is a certain kind of celebration of violence. And with respect to my friends south of the border in the Great Republic there's a fascination with violence, So as again, I want to point out that war has never been, will never be an appropriate way to solve problems that arise between nations. Why? Because it creates new and still more complicated conflicts. Just look at the current situation in the Persian Gulf. Furthermore, the damage caused by an armed conflict is not only material, but also moral. And as John Paul II declared, war is a failure of all true humanism. It's always a defeat for humanity. And finding alternative solutions to war or to conflict for resolving international disputes takes on a new urgency today, since the power of contemporary weapons of destruction make it practically impossible to limit the consequences of a conflict. Last Monday, Pope Leo, in his encyclical letter, Magnificat Humanitas, pointed out how artificial intelligence is dramatically changing how war is waged. And he deplored the fact that increasingly autonomous weapon systems operate practically beyond any human effort to govern them effectively. I'll speak to that in a little while. In a nutshell, to prevent war, it's important that we seek the causes underlying conflicts, especially those dealing with the structural situations of injustice, poverty, exploitation, and environmental degradation. Those issues need to be alleviated. That's why, for example, St. Paul VI stated that another name for peace is development. And that with profound insight of St. Paul VI is articulated first in Populorum Progressio, his encyclical that gave birth to the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development Peace. And Luke Stocking, I don't know if you had a chance to see Luke, is going to be speaking about that. Perhaps I don't need to go into, have you ever heard of the Catholic tradition regarding just peace that comes out of St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas? And you might remember, the conditions, but I maybe skip that a little bit. But what I do want to say is that it was not surprising that Pope Leo, in his encyclical that we read last Monday, called into question the just war theory, pointing that it has too often been used to justify any kind of war. For the Holy Father, the just war theory is now outdated. And he made an exception in cases of self-defense, but understood only in the strictest sense. Now, I think that Ukraine's self-defense against Putin's invasion, or Poland's self-defense against Hitler in 1935, might fall within this exception of self-defense. But outside of such an exceptional case, Pope Leo does not give much credence to just war theory. He writes, and I'm quoting him, "Humanity possesses far more effective and capable tools for promoting human life and resolving conflicts, such as dialogue, diplomacy, and forgiveness. The use of force, violence, and weapons reflects a relational poverty that has always been has had disastrous consequences for civilian populations." Now, Father John, who is a professor of international relations, might have, I think, some important and interesting comments regarding, is there still any future for the just war?
We'll talk about that.
We'll talk about that.
I think anything the teaching has changed.
Absolutely, it's changed, yeah. And I find, those of you might remember, for example, that following 9/11 and the Bush administration's decision to wanting to invade Iraq, President George W. Bush sought not only allies, but he wanted to get a kind of a blessing or agreement on the part of Pope John Paul II, who was quite elderly. And John Paul II was really not convinced that the conditions for just war were being met. You know, I mean, I can get into the details, but I think we're going to that right now. But I'm trying to say that Pope Leo's concern was that somehow, because it is the leaders of political entities that have the ultimate responsibility to determine whether those conditions are met or not. But in the name of that, there was, I don't know if you're aware of that, there was a lot of fabrication of evidence, and Colin Powell, who was the, had to make a speech for the General Assembly of the United Nations, presented evidence of weapons of mass destruction that turned out to be purely fabricated, and that was shame. So Pope Leo said, look, this is, except for the case of self-defense, this just war theory poses a lot of problems. I want to get to the Magnificat Humanitas. And for me, it's penetrating critique of the culture of power. And Leo deplores the fact that a culture of power is taking hold, in which access to and the ability to dominate tend to dictate the agenda and the criteria for decision making. So the common good of humanity is relegated to the background, and the concrete impact of war on peoples is reduced to a secondary consideration in relation to strategic interests. And Pope Leo's talked about how the culture of power is more and more infiltrating society. And indeed it grows by normalizing war, to which I was alluding to a few moments ago, by pursuing ever greater military power. We invest more and more, in Canada, but certainly south of the border, huge amounts of money in investing in military, taking advantage of the crisis of multilateralism, where these great and important institutions that came out of World War II, including the United Nations, including all kinds of, the International Criminal Court and other kinds of institutions that are supposed to limit war, these are being weakened by loss of support. And then also, Pope Leo points out that the culture of power is also being fueled by this false realism that insists that there is no alternative. So I just want to talk a little bit about this concern that Leo expressed about a certain normalization of war. And Pope Leo states that we are witnessing a real shift in public discourse and in decisions regarding rearmament, with a troubling revival of war as an instrument of international politics, while the very ethical principles that have previously limited its use, I talked about the United Nations Charter, I talked about that a little bit, these are being eroded, and forms of conflict driven by the desire for territorial expansion that were thought to be overcome have been re-emerging. I think of, for example, Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Following World War II, fighting the Charter of the United Nations and certain very important agreements at the international level in Europe, the idea of one state invading another state's territory was, we thought, something of the past. Well, we saw, first of all, in 2014 and 2022, that's no longer the case. And furthermore, Pope Leo points out that public opinion is gradually being shaped and conditioned by polarizing media narratives, which are often amplified by algorithms that prioritize conflict and confrontation. I want to speak about that a little bit more because I think it's something that we need to accept. So, Pope Leo talks about communication networks, fragmented information environments, and algorithms that reward conflict, magnify polarization and resentment, increase propaganda, and therefore make shared political discernment more difficult. Thus, war is not only fought, but also culturally conditioned through simplistic narratives, a friendly or foe mentality, disinformation, and fear. And Pope Leo says that when historical memory fades and the ethical principles that protect civilians and the most vulnerable are weakened, it becomes easier to justify violence as necessary, inevitable, and even sanitized. And recently, we've been exposed to videos related to the United States-Iran conflict that feature dramatic visuals, energetic music, and game-like elements, such as kill score counters. These clips aim to engage younger audiences. They lead to a certain trivialization of war, which some have even called a gamification of war. It is in this context that Leo fears that humanity is slipping into a violent culture of power, where peace no longer appears as a responsibility to be taken on by all citizens, but as I said, a fragile interval between conflicts. Now, I could speak at some length about, for example, the link between economic interests, the military apparatus, and the political decisions that eventually produce an armed nation, in which, as I said, war appears as a natural extension of politics. Clausewitz had something to say about that. What I want to talk about now is that the increasing investment in expenditures for sophisticated weapons is really having a real impact. We saw it a great deal, for example, in the war in Gaza, but Pope noted that more and more companies involved in development of artificial intelligence. As you probably know, there's a number of large companies in the United States that are very close to the Trump administration that are investing a great deal of money, budgets, and brains and energy in AI. And Pope Leo said that the growing ease with which these autonomous weapon systems can be deployed makes war more feasible and, importantly, less subject to human control. And this violates the principle that armed force should be used only as a last resort in cases of legitimate defense. And so for this reason, Pope Leo asserts that the development and use of AI in warfare must be subject to the most rigorous ethical constraints to guarantee respect for human dignity and the sanctity of life, and to avoid a race to develop such tools. I just want to read out for me a very, very important paragraph in the 5th section, the 5th chapter of his encyclical. Pope Leo is preoccupied by increasing talk of artificial moral agents, as if machines were able to distinguish between right and wrong with greater consistency than a human being. Yet moral judgment, the Pope emphasizes, cannot be reduced to calculation, for it involves conscience, personal responsibility, and the recognition of the other as person. Therefore, it is not permissible to entrust lethal or otherwise irreversible decisions to artificial systems. And no algorithm can make war morally acceptable. AI does not remove the intrinsic inhumanity of conflict. Indeed, it can only bring about conflict more quickly and render it more impersonal, lowering the threshold for resort to violence, transforming defense into threat prediction, and thus reducing victims to data. In this way, it will accustom us to the idea that violence is inevitable and needs only to be optimized. I don't know if any of you are fans of sci-fi films or Terminator 19 or whatever. I'm not fan of that. But there is this kind of idea of, battles taken on with very, very sophisticated artificial intelligence. I just want to close here because I want to hear a little bit what you have to say about this. Pope Leo talks about the urgent need for criteria for discernment. So, Pope Leo says that it does not diminish the importance of instilling values and sound judgment into the artificial systems we build, so that we can contribute to a moral ecosystem in which humans are better able to listen to their own consciences, as well as allowing AI models to establish appropriate boundaries. And to this end, Pope Leo formulates 3 criteria for discernment. Second week rules, for example, isn't that? So the first criterion concerns personal responsibility. When a decision to strike becomes automated or opaque, the risk of abdicating responsibility increases. For this reason, the chain of responsibility must be identifiable and verifiable. Those who design, train, and authorize and employ technology must be held accountable for their decisions. This kind of question of the threat posed by certain kind of AI-developed weapons indeed came up in the 80s when the Soviet Union was developing medium-range missiles, the SS-20s, in Eastern Europe, and the United States and NATO developed other weapons called Pershing IIs. And what happens is that the response time was a matter of seconds. If, for example, there was a fail-safe systems broke down, or if there was a glitch, somebody, would see on the radar screen what looked to be like an attack. It could be a flock of birds, Canada geese, whatever you want. It would trigger automatically a response. So that's a very real threat here. And Pope Leo is insisting on the idea of, how should I say, being able to change the chain of responsibility must be identifiable and verifiable. Few people, for example, are aware that at one point there had been, at the time of the Soviet Union, a Soviet sub that had received information that the Soviet Union had been attacked. And in these very powerful Russian submarines, or Soviet submarines, it would take 3 senior officers to agree. And 2 of the officers had agreed, put their key into it for launch, but there's a third that said no. Had the third actually inserted the key and agreed, it could have led to a cataclysmic kind of nuclear exchange. And that's in the 80s. Second criterion pertains to the moral time frame for making judgments. While artificial intelligence tend to expedite the decision-making process, speed and efficiency should never be the supreme motivating force for the irreversible decisions made in the context of war. Just talk about that in some reason. And the third criterion is the identification and protection of civilians. And any technology that facilitates attacks without seeing the human beings, the face of human beings, lowers the moral threshold of conflict. So target selection and use of force must not be allowed to confuse combatants and non-combatants, nor ignore the impact on defenseless populations. I think some of you are aware, for example, of the Israeli Defense Forces will be engaged in destroying entire neighborhoods because they believe that they have some belief that a member of Hamas might be in the neighborhood, even if that kind of attack that is supported by artificial intelligence literally wipes out, a city block or a whole. So those are kind of criteria that Leo brings. I mean, I say this because I would like, as much as possible, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read Magnificat Humanitas. It's very rich, some parts require an investment of time and intelligence, but for me, it's very, very real rich, very rich. Again, as I said right at the beginning, I am very grateful to the Holy Spirit for giving us the gift, Catholic social thought, and leadership that is able to articulate it to our world in a credible way. And in many ways, challenge us today, here in Canada, here in Toronto, about what are we doing to promote peace, which is our duty, not only as Catholic Christians, but as human beings. Well, I've spoken enough. Maybe you'd like to take your comments. I recognize, John, that this area of international relations.
I'm struck by your keynote this morning, Bishop Mark. I thought, you must have studied international relations, or you follow it and you read it, and that's
A little bit.
It's nice to know that there are bishops out there doing that. And was that your initial training? Or your?
I did a double major in physical geography and international relations at UBC. And it was the balance of power ethic that kind of brought me to a faith crisis as a young man.
Well, yeah.
Because it was just, it just wasn't, at the very least logical, let alone moral. And so that it kind of...
Do you remember Reinhold Niebuhr's book, Moral Man and Moral Society?
Yeah.
That was a big book in the 30s, with the rise of Hitler. He was a Christian theologian, Protestant, who said that as much as man is moral, human beings are moral, sometimes societies are not bound by the same morality. Interesting point. But anyway, I struggle with the thing about just war, and I included it in my Christianity and politics course, because Christians have been all over the map on war. If you're an Anabaptist or a Mennonite, right, war is always wrong, and they will not serve in the forces, and maybe not even pay tax. So minimal involvement with the state. Of course, in our Catholic tradition, we have a more nuanced view of just war, and the criteria, for instance, are very stringent. And there's a literature in the last 10, 15, 20 years from Pope John Paul II, Benedict, Francis, to say that modern warfare is so horrific that just war is now outdated. Which I see, but again, tell that to Ukrainians, if you're dealing with a Putin or if you're dealing with a Hitler, or in the 90s, remember R2P, right to protect. Kosovo is a good example.
Absolutely.
And at our center, I wear many hats, but we did an event on, it's the 25th anniversary of the bombing of Kosovo. And I saw these Kosovar refugees, former refugees, get up, and there were all these men and women in uniform, Canadian Armed Forces, and the Kosovar refugees are saying to them, thank you for bombing our country because you got rid of the Serbs. So, again, if you possess the technology to defend innocent civilians from Slobodan Milosevic and the terrible things that happened. So, the world's messy, you have these aggressors out there. You have unfortunately, the Hitlers and the Putins. So, as much as part of me would love to be an absolute pacifist and say, I should be like Gandhi and just be nonviolent resistance, but there is we live in this world of aggressive states, and how do you deal with them?
One of my dilemmas.
Diplomacy, obviously.
Diplomacy. Think about, President Bill Clinton putting a veto on General Romeo Dalao's intervention to protect, the Tutsis during the massacre. I'm just saying, I would say, there's self-defense as an exception, but there's also I don't have time to go into it, but I wrote about it quite a bit, is about the duty to protect innocent.
Yes.
Yeah. And that showed up not only, of course, in that horrible situation in Kosovo, showed up in Rwanda, in the genocide, but also it presents itself in Syria. You remember Lloyd Axworthy wrote very, very powerfully about the responsibility of nations to intervene because Assad was using poison gas against its own population. You know? Anyways, you might recall that, and remember that Barack Obama had talked about using gas by President Assad was crossing a red line, but then the international community refused to step forward to protect the innocent. Anyways, I'm challenged
But
by
we
that.
are more militaristic, we are normalizing war. It bothers me to see like war presented as a game. And some of the ads you see online and things like this is fun, it's like a video game. I mean, my nephews are into video games, and I said, oh, God forbid that. I mean, one's thinking of, I mean, I have a lot of respect for the armed forces, you know, my relatives have served in them. But, you know, it seems that with the technology, war is becoming a game.
I was going to mention.
And that's a very scary thing, I think.
Yeah, in my talk that it was the speaking politically versus speaking theologically.
Yeah.
And one of the worst, best examples is there does come a point where the most pathetic examples of pacifism will come up against, you know, the bizarre single act of Golgotha that saved the world. And what do you do with that other than proclaim it and honor it? I mean, that's why, you know, Pope Leo, his discussion, it wasn't really a discussion, his response, which Trump took the way he did, you know, he's not speaking, he's speaking a certain language. It's about proclaiming the gospel, full stop.
Yeah.
And you know, I confess, I was even going to make a confession in my expose that, you know, when it comes to the balance of power, if I was in that position, I would still be a little bit more Old Testament, if you know what I mean. Not eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but, you know, in addressing the situations you've just outlined, I would not leave my nation absolutely defenseless, but I would hope that I would do everything I could to not at least do the minimum of the just war theory and more. And so but I think these discussions are really important. And you know, you know, I first saw your talk here, I wasn't sure where you were going to go, and I was wondering if you might go into, you know, from global to local, and you know, because you know we're so obsessed with the local, the global. We're so obsessed with the global that it's tough to look at and relate to local scenarios that are the source of great increasing tensions. And
Are you thinking of something in particular? Or?
Well, I'm thinking of all sorts of things, but maybe I'll just say this, and this is such a 1/1,000,000th of an example. The genius, and I think I can call it that now, of the Indigenous Reconciliation Fund, is it finally said, let's stop looking global and look local at concrete little things we can do with the limited resources we have to support local relationship building, and stopping the rhetoric around, you know, around not getting any further with truth and reconciliation, which is both an Indigenous and non-Indigenous issue, and build peace and right relationship, shalom, together. And you know what? We're making some progress. You know, but we spin that off in other areas.
You know, earlier you were talking about, for example, when we were having a private conversation, I think, for example, there is a reality of, you know, criminal gangs. And in your diocese, posse, indigenous mafia.
Indigenous gang,
Lots of them, yeah.
Lots of them, very powerful, heavy.
I met them in the jail.
Well, yeah. Well, I like meeting them in jail. I do. You know, these are not, you know, these are not choir boys. These are really.
They are not.
They're little boys at times. They're looking for mom, but that's true too. Restorative justice work discovered that. But what I'm trying to say is that you need to counter that too. You know, I mean, one of the indigenous communities not terribly far from Montreal, I'd rather not give the name, is largely held hostage by criminal organizations that are working in cahoots with certain local indigenous leaders because they find it in their interest. Don't quote me that in the Catholic Register, but you get the picture. It's one of my concerns about the fact that you have to deal with, people that are engaged in traffic of weapons, heavy drugs, human trafficking, locally. And you need to have sophisticated policing, people trained in weapons of war to be able to counter that.
Look at Mexico right now.
Well, tell me
where
about
the gangs seem to be, in some places, more powerful than the government.
Exactly.
So it's not easy.
So it's one of those tricky, tough situations I find. Matthew, have you any thoughts on these?
I was just thinking, I think I'd like to start at least a short, maybe email conversation between this gentleman, because some of the areas I think ought to be explored. I was a policeman myself for that. And so the law draws a difference between defense of self and defense of others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also, I think there's got to be distinctions that are not hugely discussed between individual duties and then social duties. Consistent with individual and social sin, right? Like, when is it the United States' problem to go intervene in Venezuela? As opposed to if I'm standing in Venezuela and I see somebody bad about to happen, somebody I have the power to do something with them.
Sure, yeah.
Those distinctions I think might merit being looked at. At least I'm not sure of any discussions on them. But it seems to me like there's things food for thought there.
Well, again, like so many issues, we're so polarized. Like, I find what we've lost is a sense of proportion. So nobody wants Iran to get a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that you carpet bomb the whole
Exactly.
country? Nobody can or few can justify October 7th, but does that mean you kill tens of thousands of Palestinians? So it's like, okay, what's the right and wrong in this issue? Let's talk about that.
Because in some
Then what do you do about
it's
it?
proportionality and immediacy.
Yeah. There might be other ways of preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon, right? International, they've tried sanctions, they've tried everything. But it seems to me we go very quickly from this is wrong and we are going to use ultimate force to wipe it out.
And just on the side, it concerns me too that all of these things seem to resolve into battles over who gets to control the war coming out of that place.
Battles, right?
I said, it seems to me like too many of these conflicts seem to resolve after the high talk about preventing this and preventing that into who gets to control the oil coming out of this place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Pope Leo also mentioned the fact that sometimes in certain regimes where there's instability, going to war, engaging in war, is a way of distracting the population electorate from war. And I think it's south of the border that's happening there.
Yeah.
The president has found, military adventure is a way of distracting the population.
Well, I've heard that he's
from
practicing against his own people too. He's already tried out the National Guard, he's tried out his own police force.
Yeah.
I'm very concerned.
Yeah. I found all kinds of places in that, which is addressing precisely the situation in many countries, the kind of situation you're referring to.
I was in Israel in 1984 on kibbutz for 3 months and experienced the, what do they call it? It's a type of remembrance day in which they remember the Yom Kippur War.
Yes.
And the Never Again, which goes back also to the conclusion of World War II. But I was thinking about this balance of power thing and the Israeli statement back then, which the rest of the nation adopted, and it was really a military strategy. It was almost like a national religious, is that if we are hit once, we will hit back 10 times.
That's the
And that's been right till today. And they never said it sort of a moral defense of their nation state, but that's really what it was when you're surrounded by 6 or 7 nation states that want your annihilation. You respond tenfold or sevenfold or whatever. And that is the only practical way that you will continue to exist. So I kind of see, 40 years later, 30 years, whatever it is later, there's still more or less living out of that. But it was interesting to see it came out of in part anyway, a religious, a national expression of never forget.
Yeah. Peter Weinhardt has written a remarkable book. Peter Weinhardt is in many ways kind of a conservative Jew. Has been challenging, Jewish identity in light of Gaza. He has really looked at this issue very, very seriously. He has lost not a few friends because of his stand against, for example, the Netanyahu government's policies in the occupied territories, and especially in Gaza. But he was dealing precisely with the point that you were making a few minutes ago. When can Israelis and indeed supporters from other parts of get out of that mentality of the need to wreak 10 times more unconscious about time.
Yeah, I think so, we might have the screen, yeah.
Yeah, there's actually a similar topic in the
Yeah.
justice piece in the
Well, I thank you for having me.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.